The sun hung low over the desolate town of Dusty Gulch, casting long shadows across the abandoned main street. A woman's desperate voice shattered the eerie silence. "I'm begging you, hurry up." Her words echoed off the weathered wooden buildings, carrying with them a weight of terror that made time itself seem to slow. The cowboy standing before her, his face hidden beneath the brim of his dust-covered hat, took a single deliberate step forward. What happened next would haunt the memories of everyone who witnessed it, an act so unthinkable that it would be whispered about in saloons and around campfires for generations to come. This is a story of desperation and choice, of a moment when the line between right and wrong blurred like a mirage in the desert heat. What drives a person to do the unthinkable? What happens when mercy and justice collide in a place where law is nothing more than a distant memory? In the dying light of that fateful evening, one man's decision would change everything, forever altering the course of lives intertwined by fate, blood, and an impossible choice that no one should ever have to make. The town of Dusty Gulch had been dying for years, but nobody had bothered to tell its remaining inhabitants. What was once a thriving mining settlement had withered into a collection of sun-bleached buildings and broken dreams, populated by those too stubborn or too poor to leave. The cowboy known only as Cole had ridden into town 3 days earlier, his horse weary and his saddlebags light. He wasn't looking for trouble. He never was. But trouble had a way of finding men like him, men whose pasts cast shadows longer than their bodies ever could. Cole had taken a room above the saloon, the only establishment still doing any kind of business in the forsaken town. The proprietor, a heavy-set woman named Martha with eyes that had seen too much sorrow, asked no questions when he paid for a week in advance with silver coins that looked older than the town itself. He kept to himself, mostly spending his days sitting on the porch outside his room, watching the dust devils dance in the street below and the vultures circle overhead, nature's patient undertakers waiting for the town to finally surrender to the desert. On the second day, he noticed her, a young woman perhaps, 25, with dark hair pulled back in a practical bun and a face that still held traces of beauty, despite the hardness that frontier life had carved into her features. Her name was Sarah Makepeace, and she ran the general store her father had established before consumption took him 2 winters past. She moved through the town with purpose, her spine straight despite the burden she carried, both literal and figurative. Cole watched her from his perch, recognizing in her walk the same determination that had kept him alive through countless trials. But Sarah wasn't alone in Dusty Gulch. Her younger brother, Thomas, barely 17, worked at the stable that serviced the occasional travelers still foolish enough to pass through this forsaken place. The boy had their father's height but not yet his strength, all gangly limbs and nervous energy, with eyes that darted around like a cornered animal's. Cole had seen that look before, on the faces of young men who stood at the precipice of choices that would define the rest of their lives, however long or short those lives might be. The trouble, when it arrived, wore a badge that gleamed too brightly for a place as tarnished as Dusty Gulch. 3 men rode in at noon on the third day. Deputy Marshal Pike and his 2 hired guns, a pair of brothers named Cutter and Vance Holloway. Pike was a tall man with a face like weathered leather and eyes the color of dirty ice. The star on his chest was real, but the authority it represented had been corrupted long ago by greed and an appetite for cruelty that the frontier seemed to nurture in certain men. Cole observed from the shadows as Pike and his men tied their horses outside the general store and walked inside, with the confidence of men who expected no resistance. Through the window, he could see Sarah behind the counter, her face draining of color as Pike approached. The conversation was brief, punctuated by Pike's harsh laughter and Sarah's barely audible responses. When they emerged 15 minutes later, the deputy was smiling, but it was the kind of smile that made Cole's hand drift unconsciously toward the Colt at his hip. That evening, Martha brought Cole his supper beans and hardtack with a piece of salt pork that might have been fresh some time in the previous week. As she set the plate down, She spoke quietly without meeting his eyes. "You seem like a man who knows when to mind his own business. That's a valuable quality in a place like this." Her voice carried a warning wrapped in concern. Cole nodded slowly, understanding the message beneath the words. "Been minding my own business for years, ma'am. Gotten pretty good at it." But even as he spoke those words, Cole knew they were a lie. A man like him could never truly mind his own business, not when he recognized the signs of a situation spiraling toward violence. He'd seen it too many times before. The way Pike had looked at Sarah, the proprietary gleam in his eyes. The nervous tension in young Thomas's shoulders whenever the deputy was mentioned. The way the other townspeople seemed to shrink into themselves, hoping to become invisible until the storm passed. That night, Cole couldn't sleep. He sat by his window, watching the moonlight paint the street silver, and thought about the choices that had brought him to this particular moment in this particular dying town. He'd been running for so long that he'd almost forgotten what it felt like to stand still, to plant his feet and say, "No further." But something about Dusty Gulch, about Sarah and her brother, about the casual evil, represented by a badge worn by a man who long ago stopped caring about right and wrong, something about all of it made the old familiar anger kindle in his chest, that righteous fury he'd thought he'd bury along with so many other things. The next morning brought answers he hadn't asked for. Thomas came to Cole's door just after dawn, his face pale and his hands shaking. "Mr. Cole," he stammered, "I need. My sister said I shouldn't bother you, but I don't know who else ... double quotes." The boy's voice cracked, and Cole saw tears threatening to spill from his reddened eyes. Cole gestured for him to enter, and Thomas spilled out a story that was both achingly familiar and uniquely tragic. The kind of tale that had been repeated countless times across the frontier, in countless towns, by countless desperate people with nowhere left to turn. Thomas's story unfolded in fits and starts, interrupted by long pauses where the boy seemed to struggle with shame and fear in equal measure. 6 months earlier, their father had died owing money, a lot of money, to a man named Silas Cord, who owned most of the remaining viable property in Dusty Gulch. Cord was a ghost in their story, never present but always looming. His influence felt through intermediaries and debt collectors. When the old man died, his debts had fallen to his children like an inheritance of chains. Sarah had tried to keep the store running, to pay down what they owed through honest labor and careful management. But Cord's interest rates were designed to ensure that the debt never shrank, only grew. Then, 3 months ago, Deputy Marshal Pike had arrived in town, nominally to investigate some cattle rustling in the county, but everyone knew the reason. He and Cord were old partners, and Pike was there to collect on debts that Cord could untouch himself without attracting the wrong kind of attention from territorial authorities. Pike had made Sarah an offer, Thomas explained, his voice barely above a whisper. If she would keep company with the deputy, make him comfortable during his extended stay in Dusty Gulch, he would see to it that the debt was forgiven. The alternative, he'd made abundantly clear, was that Thomas would be arrested on fabricated charges. Pike had already planted stolen goods in the stable where the boy worked, and the general store would be seized to pay the debt. Thomas would hang, or at best rot in territorial prison, and Sarah would be left with nothing. Cole listened without interruption, his face revealing nothing of the cold rage building inside him. He'd known men like Pike, had served with some during the war, had killed others afterward when circumstance demanded it. They were men who'd learned that a badge or a uniform could be used as both shield and weapon. That authority without accountability was just another word for tyranny. "What did your sister decide?" Cole asked, though he thought he already knew the answer. "She told him no," Thomas said, and there was pride in his voice despite his fear. "She told him she'd rather lose everything than submit to blackmail." But Pike ... he just laughed. He gave her 3 days to reconsider. Said if she didn't come to his hotel room by sunset on the 3rd day, he'd arrest me that very night. The boy looked up at Cole with desperate eyes. "Today's the third day, Mr. Cole. Sarah thinks she can appeal to whatever decency he might have left. Maybe buy us time to raise the money another way. But I've seen how he looks at her. I've seen men look at horses that way before they break them." Cole stood and walked to the window, his mind working through possibilities and probabilities. "Where's Pike now?" he asked. Thomas told him the deputy and his men were camped just outside town at an old prospector's cabin that Cord owned. They'd be back by mid-afternoon, Pike had said, to receive Sarah's answer. "And your sister? Where is she?" "At the store, preparing to close it up." "She's going to go to him, Mr. Cole. She's going to sacrifice herself to save me." Thomas's voice broke completely now. "I can't let her do that. I'd rather hang than have her debase herself for my sake. But I don't know how to stop her. I'm not brave like she is. I'm not strong." Cole turned to face the boy, and something in his expression made Thomas straighten unconsciously. "Strength isn't about muscle or size, son. It's about standing when every fiber of your being is screaming at you to run. It's about doing what needs doing, even when you're terrified." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "Your sister is strong. You're strong too. You came here, didn't you? Asking for help takes a different kind of courage. Will you help us?" Thomas asked, and the hope in his voice was painful to hear. "I don't have money to pay you, and I know a man like you doesn't work for free. But I swear on my father's grave that I'll find a way to repay you whatever it takes for as long as it takes." Cole didn't answer immediately. He knew what helping meant. It meant putting himself between Sarah and Pike, which meant violence. It meant abandoning the anonymity he'd worked so hard to maintain, the careful invisibility that had kept him alive for 3 years. It meant possibly killing a lawman, corrupt or not, which would bring down more trouble than any sane man would invite. It meant all the things he'd promised himself he wouldn't do anymore, all the lines he'd sworn he wouldn't cross again. But when he looked at Thomas, he saw other faces from other times, young soldiers he'd failed to save, innocent people who'd suffered because he'd chosen the safer path, the ghosts that haunted his dreams and whispered accusations in the darkness. "I'll help," he said simply. "But you need to understand something, Thomas. Once I step into this, there's no knowing how it'll end. Pike won't back down just because someone stands up to him. Men like that, they can't afford to show weakness. This is likely to get messy." "I understand," Thomas said, though Cole doubted the boy truly comprehended what might be required. "What do you need me to do?" Cole outlined a plan, simple but dangerous, that relied on timing and the element of surprise. Thomas would go to the stable and prepare 2 fast horses, provisioned for a long ride. Cole would confront Pike at the general store when the deputy arrived for Sarah's answer. If things went the way Cole expected, the way they always seemed to go when men like Pike felt their authority challenged, there would be shooting. Thomas and Sarah needed to be ready to ride out immediately afterward, before Pike's men could react, before the situation deteriorated further. "Where will we go?" Thomas asked. "Pike's a federal deputy. He can follow us anywhere in the territory." "You'll go to Fort Collins," Cole replied. "I know a judge there, man by the name of Thornton. He's one of the few honest ones left. You tell him your story, and you tell him Cole Brennan sent you." He saw Thomas's eyes widen at the name. Apparently, the boy had heard of him after all. "Judge Thornton will know what to do about Pike and Cord. He'll have the authority to investigate them properly, and he owes me a favor from way back." After Thomas left to prepare the horses, Cole sat alone in his room and checked his weapons with the methodical care of long practice. His Colt was clean and loaded, the action smooth from thousands of draws. His Winchester rifle leaned against the wall, similarly maintained. He had 2 knives, one in his boot, one at the small of his back, and a derringer in his vest pocket, his final insurance policy. A man could never have too many options when facing uncertain odds. As noon approached, Cole made his way down to the general store. Sarah was inside, packing supplies into crates with mechanical efficiency, her face a mask of forced calm. When she saw Cole enter, she stiffened. "Mr. Brennan," she said, so she knew his name too. "I appreciate your concern, but this is a family matter. Thomas had no right to involve you." "Thomas did what needed doing," Cole replied. "Same as you think you're doing now. But there's a difference between sacrifice and suicide, ma'am. What Pike's asking isn't just wrong. It's the beginning, not the end. Men like him, they take and take until there's nothing left to take. You give him this, he'll own you forever." Sarah's composure cracked slightly, her eyes glistening. "And what choice do I have? Let my brother hang for crimes he didn't commit? Watch everything our father built get stripped away? At least this way, Thomas survives. At least this way, there's some hope for the future." "There's another way," Cole said. "But it requires you to trust me, and it requires you to be ready to leave everything behind. This store, this town, all of it. Can you do that?" Before Sarah could answer, the sound of horses approaching drew their attention to the window. Pike and the Holloway brothers were riding down the main street, their shadows stretching long in the afternoon sun. The deputy was smiling that predatory smile again, confident in his power, secure in the belief that he held all the cards. He had no idea that the game had changed, that the quiet cowboy who'd been watching from the shadows for 3 days was about to flip the table entirely. Pike dismounted and tied his horse with casual arrogance. The Holloway brothers flanked him, their hands resting on their gun belts. More for show than readiness, they'd never expected real resistance in this dying town. As they approached the store, Cole positioned himself just inside the doorway, in the shadows where he couldn't be easily seen from outside. "Get behind the counter," he told Sarah quietly. "Whatever happens, stay down." The door opened, and Pike strode in like a man entering his own property. "Well, Miss Makepeace," he began, his voice loud and jovial, "I trust you've had time to consider my generous offer. I'm a patient man, as you know, but even my patience has its." He stopped mid-sentence as Cole stepped forward into the light, his presence suddenly filling the small store like gathering thunder before a storm. Pike's smile faded, replaced by a calculating wariness. "Who the hell are you?" "Nobody important," Cole said evenly. "Just a man who doesn't like the way you do business, deputy." He emphasized the title with just enough contempt to make Pike's jaw tighten. "The lady's given you her answer. It's no. Time for you and your friends to move along." For a long moment, nobody moved. The Holloway brothers had followed Pike into the store and now stood flanking the deputy, their relaxed postures shifting into something more alert, more dangerous. Pike's hand drifted toward his revolver, then stopped as he reassessed the situation. Something in Cole's stance, in the absolute stillness of his gun hand, in the cold certainty in his eyes, gave even the corrupt lawman pause. "You're Cole Brennan," Pike said finally, recognition dawning on his face. "Heard you were dead. Heard a lot of stories about you, most of them ending with you on the wrong end of a rope or a bullet. Stories have a way of getting exaggerated," Cole replied. "But here's a true one. You're going to walk out of here empty-handed. No more threats, no more extortion. The Makepieces are done with you. Their debt is their own concern, and they'll settle it honestly or not at all. But you're not part of that equation anymore." Pike's face flushed with anger, the affable mask slipping to reveal the cruel man beneath. "You threatening a federal officer? That's a hanging offense, Brennan. And these witnesses here will swear you drew on me first." He gestured to the Holloway brothers, who nodded in unison, their hands now hovering over their weapons. 3 against 1, Cole observed calmly. "You feel good about those odds, deputy?" What happened next occurred in the space between heartbeats. Vance Holloway, the younger and more impulsive of the brothers, made his move first, his hand darting toward his pistol with practiced speed. But Cole was faster not by much, but in a gunfight, a fraction of a second is the difference between living and dying. His Colt cleared leather and barked twice, the reports deafening in the confined space of the store. Vance Holloway stumbled backward, looking down in surprise at the two crimson flowers blooming on his chest, then collapsed into a shelf of dry goods, his unfired weapon clattering to the floor. Cutter Holloway roared in anguish and rage, forgetting technique in his grief, spraying bullets wildly from his revolver. Cole dropped into a crouch behind a barrel of flour, feeling the rounds whip past where his head had been seconds before. Sarah screamed from behind the counter. Pike had drawn his weapon too, but seemed frozen, shocked by the sudden explosive violence, his carefully controlled situation spiraling into chaos. Cole rolled left, coming up beside a support post, and fired 3 times in rapid succession. His first shot missed Cutter, but caught Pike in the shoulder, spinning the deputy around. The second and third rounds found Cutter Holloway's center mass, stopping the man's charge as if he'd run into an invisible wall. The hired gun took 2 more stumbling steps forward, trying through sheer will to keep fighting, but his body had other ideas. He fell to his knees, then pitched forward onto his face, his brother's name a gurgling whisper on his lips. The silence that followed the gunfire was profound, broken only by Pike's labored breathing and Sarah sobbing. The store was a wreck, broken glass and spilled goods everywhere, the air thick with gun smoke. Cole stood slowly, his Colt still trained on Pike, who sat slumped against the wall, his right hand pressed against his wounded shoulder, while his left still loosely held his pistol. "Drop it," Cole ordered. Pike let the gun fall from his fingers, his face pale from pain and shock. "You killed them," the deputy said, his voice thick with disbelief. "You killed federal agents. You're a dead man, Brennan. They'll hunt you to the ends of the earth. They were hired killers who happened to work for a corrupt lawman," Cole corrected. "And you're still breathing because I chose to wound you instead of killing you. Though I'm questioning that decision right about now." He moved closer, kicking Pike's pistol away. "Here's what's going to happen. You going to ride out of here, and you going to tell Silas Cord that his little game is over. The Makepieces are under my protection now, and any attempt to harm them or collect that fraudulent debt will be answered in kind. Do you understand?" Pike nodded, his teeth gritted against the pain. Then something changed in his expression, a cunning look that made Cole instantly wary. "You think this is over?" Pike hissed. "You think killing 2 men and wounding me solves anything? Cord has a dozen more like the Holloways, and I have the entire Federal Marshal Service behind me. You're not protecting these people. You're signing their death warrants." Before Cole could respond, the door burst open and Thomas rushed in, his eyes wild with fear. "Sarah, I heard shots." He stopped dead, taking in the scene of carnage. The 2 bodies, the blood. Pike slumped against the wall, his sister emerging from behind the counter with tears streaming down her face. "Oh God, oh Jesus, what have we done?" "What we had to," Sarah said, her voice surprisingly steady despite her tears. She looked at Cole with something between gratitude and horror. "Mr. Brennan, I thank you. But Thomas is right to be frightened. This isn't over. This can't be over. You've just killed 2 of Deputy Pike's men. The law," Cole interrupted, "will see 2 corrupt hired guns who drew first on a man defending innocence from extortion. That's the story, and that's the truth. Pike here will back that up, won't you, Deputy?" He pressed the barrel of his Colt against Pike's wounded shoulder, making the man gasp in pain. "Because if he doesn't, if he tries to spin this any other way, I'll make sure Judge Thornton in Fort Collins hears all about his arrangement with Silas Cord, about the planted evidence, about the extortion. A man in Pike's position can't afford that kind of scrutiny." Pike glared at Cole with pure hatred, but he nodded. "Self-defense," he managed through gritted teeth. "The Holloways got overzealous. Drew first. That's my official statement." "Good," Cole said. He turned to Thomas. "Horses ready?" The boy nodded numbly. "Then help your sister gather what she needs. You've got 10 minutes before you ride out for Fort Collins. I'll write you a letter for Judge Thornton, explaining the situation, But even as he spoke, Cole heard something that changed everything. The sound of many horses approaching fast. He moved to the window and cursed under his breath. At least 8 riders were thundering into town, led by a man in expensive suit, astride a black stallion that looked worth more than the entire town. Silas Cord had arrived, and he brought his private army with him. "We're out of time," Cole said flatly. Sarah and Thomas joined him at the window, their faces draining of color as they recognized Cord. "Back door?" Cole asked. Thomas shook his head. "There's no back door. Papa always meant to add one, but never got around to it." Cord and his men dismounted in front of the store, and even from this distance, Cole could see the rage on the businessman's face. Someone must have ridden out to warn him about the confrontation, about Pike and the Holloways. Now Cord was here to finish this personally, and he brought enough firepower to do it with certainty. "Brennan!" Cord's voice boomed across the street. "I know you're in there. Send out the makepieces and surrender yourself. You have my word no harm will come to them if you comply. But if you force me to come in there and get you, I cannot guarantee their safety. You have 1 minute to decide." Cole looked at Sarah and Thomas, saw the terror in their eyes, saw them looking to him for a miracle he wasn't sure he could provide. Pike, still slumped against the wall, was smiling now despite his pain. "Told you," the deputy said softly. "You're not a protector. You're just a killer who's run out of places to run." Cole's mind raced through options, each one worse than the last. They were trapped in a store with one entrance, facing 8 armed men who had no reason to show mercy. The Holloways' bodies lay cooling on the floor, a testimony to what happened when good intentions collided with harsh reality. In less than a minute, Cord would give the order to attack, and this store would become a slaughterhouse. "I'm sorry," Cole said to Sarah and Thomas. "I thought I could help, but it just made things worse. That seems to be my particular talent." Sarah surprised him by gripping his arm firmly. "No," she said with unexpected strength. "You gave us something we hadn't had in months, Hope. You showed us that standing up to evil is possible, even if it costs everything. My father used to say that how a person dies tells you more about them than how they lived. If we die here today, we die fighting. We die free, and that matters." Her words struck something deep in Cole's chest. Some ember of the man he'd been before the war, before the running, before he'd learned to look away from injustice, because getting involved meant pain and loss. He thought about all the times he'd ridden on, telling himself that other people's problems weren't his concern, that survival required isolation. He thought about the faces that haunted his dreams, the people he might have saved if he'd been brave enough to try. "Thomas," Cole said quietly, "take that Winchester from over there and position yourself by the window on the left side. You see any of Cord's men trying to flank us, you shoot. Don't aim, don't hesitate, just point and fire. Sarah, there's a derringer in my vest pocket. Take it. If anyone gets through that door who isn't me, you use it. And you," he turned to Pike, "you're going to do the unthinkable." Pike looked confused. "What are you talking about?" Cole hauled the deputy to his feet, ignoring his yelp of pain. "You're going to walk out there, and you're going to tell Cord to stand down. You're going to tell him that this situation is being resolved peacefully, under federal authority, and that any interference will be treated as obstruction of justice. You're going to use that badge you've corrupted, and for once do something right with it." Pike laughed bitterly. "Why the hell would I do that? Those people out there are my partners. You killed 2 of my men. Give me one good reason I shouldn't walk out there and tell Cord to burn this place to the ground with all of you in it." Cole pressed his Colt against Pike's temple. "Because," he said softly, "if you don't, you won't live to see what happens next. And because somewhere under all that corruption, you used to be a lawman. You used to believe in something besides money and power. I'm giving you a chance to remember that, to do one decent thing before you're too far gone to ever come back." The silence stretched long enough that Cole thought Pike would refuse. would choose death or betrayal over redemption. Then, incredibly, the deputy nodded. "I must be out of my mind," Pike muttered. "But I'll try. Don't expect miracles, Brennan. Cord's not the reasonable type, especially when someone's killed his hired help and embarrassed him in front of his men. Just get him talking," Cole said. "Buy us some time to figure out our next move." Pike stumbled toward the door, his wounded shoulder hanging awkwardly, his face pale from blood loss. Cole kept his Colt trained on the deputy's back until he was outside, then shifted his aim toward the window, ready to fire if this was an elaborate trick. Sarah stood close beside him, the derringer in her trembling hand, while Thomas crouched by the opposite window, the Winchester pressed to his shoulder with more courage than skill. Through the window, Cole watched Pike approach Cord. The businessman's expression shifted from rage to confusion as the wounded deputy spoke urgently, gesturing back toward the store. The conversation was too distant to hear clearly, but Cole could read body language, could see Cord's anger warring with uncertainty. Pike was a good liar. He'd had plenty of practice, and he was using every ounce of that skill now. Then everything went wrong. One of Cord's men, a scarred brute with a face like chewed leather, suddenly drew his pistol and shot Pike in the back. The deputy pitched forward without a sound, dead before he hit the dirt. Cord spun on the shooter, clearly furious, but the damage was done. Whatever Pike had been saying, whatever slim chance at negotiation might have existed, it died with him in the dusty street. "Jesus Christ," Thomas breathed. "They just killed their own man." Cole's mind raced. The shooter had acted on his own, without orders, which meant Cord's control over his men was imperfect. That was useful information, if they survived long enough to use it. The businessman was shouting at the scarred man now, his face purple with rage. But the other hired guns were getting nervous, their hands on their weapons, their eyes fixed on the store. "Brennan!" Cord's voice cracked like a whip. "That idiot just cost Pike his life, and you whatever slim chance you had at surrender. I'm done being patient. You've got 30 seconds to walk out with your hands up, or we burn you out. The Makepieces can still walk away from this, but only if you give yourself up right now." "He's lying," Sarah said. "You know he's lying. The moment you're out there, he'll kill all of us." Cole knew she was right, but he also knew their situation was hopeless. 8 guns against 3 2.5, really. Given Thomas as inexperience in a building with one exit and wooden walls that wouldn't stop a determined bullet. They might take a few of Cord's men with them, but the outcome was inevitable. Cole had survived this long by knowing when to fold, when to accept that some situations had no winning move. But surrendering, walking out there to be executed like a dog in the street while Sarah and Thomas watched, unable to do anything to save them afterward, that wasn't survival. That was just dying slowly. At least here, fighting, they could control their own end. "We hold here," Cole said, his voice calm despite the storm of calculations running through his mind. "Make them come to us. Every second we delay is a second something might change. Someone might arrive. Some opportunity might present itself. Don't think about what happens in an hour. Focus on the next minute, then the next one after that." Cord's 30 seconds stretched into a minute, then 2. The businessman was conferring with his remaining men, pointing toward the store, clearly planning their assault. Cole used the time to check his ammunition, redistribute the weapons. Thomas had 6 shots in the Winchester and 2 handfuls of loose cartridges in his pockets. Sarah had 2 shots in the Derringer. Cole had 4 rounds left in his Colt and his boot knife. Laughably inadequate, but it would have to do. Then Martha, the saloon keeper, came running down the street, waving her arms. "Mr. Cord. Mr. Cord, please. You have to stop this. Whatever's happened, burning down buildings isn't the answer. The general store is the only place in town where people can get supplies. Destroy it, and you'll kill this town completely." Cord barely glanced at her. "The town's already dead, Martha. It just doesn't know it yet. Now get out of the way before you get hurt." But Martha's intervention had an unexpected effect. Other townspeople began emerging from their hiding places, drawn by her bravery or perhaps shamed by it. Old Man Peterson from the hardware store, the widow Harrison and her 3 daughters, even the young Chinese cook from the restaurant. They came out one by one, a ragged collection of the desperate and the downtrodden, and they stood in the street between Cord's men and the general store. "You'll have to go through us first," Martha said, and though her voice shook, she didn't back down. "These are good people in there. Sarah and Thomas never hurt anyone. And if Mr. Brennan killed Pike's men, it's because they were trying to force themselves on Sarah. We all know what Pike was doing, what you and him had arranged. It was wrong, and we should have said something sooner. But we're saying it now." Cord's face twisted with contempt. "You fools. You think standing here makes you brave? Makes you righteous? I own this town. Every building, every grain of wheat, every drop of water in the well, it's all mine. You're nothing but tenants, and you're about to be evicted." One of his men raised his rifle toward the crowd, and Cole felt his finger tighten on the trigger of his Colt. He could shoot the man through the window, drop him before he fired, but that would just provoke the massacre he was trying to prevent. The situation balanced on knife's edge, one wrong move from spiraling into carnage. Then Sarah did the unthinkable. She stood up from behind the counter, pushed past Cole's restraining arm, and walked toward the door. "Sarah, no!" Thomas screamed, but she ignored him. Cole tried to grab her, but she was faster than he expected, slipping through his grasp and out the door before he could stop her. Sarah stood in the doorway, framed by the afternoon sun, her chin raised, and her eyes blazing with a defiance that made her beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with physical features. "Mr. Cord," she called out, her voice carrying clear across the street. "I'm Sarah Makepeace. You want to hurt someone? You hurt me. I'm the one who refused Deputy Pike's arrangement. I'm the one who asked Mr. Brennan to help us. My brother is innocent. These townspeople are innocent. If blood needs to be spilled to satisfy your pride, take mine and let the rest of them go." For a moment, Cole saw something flicker across Cord's face: surprise, maybe even reluctant admiration. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by cold calculation. The businessman was a predator, and Sarah had just presented herself as prey. "All right," Cord said, his voice dangerously soft. "Come here, Miss Makepeace. Let's discuss terms." Sarah took a step forward, but Cole was already moving. He burst through the doorway, grabbing Sarah and pulling her behind him, his Colt trained on Cord. "No deals," he said flatly. "No negotiations. This ends now, one way or another." The scarred man who'd shot Pike raised his rifle again, and Cole knew they were out of time. He'd have to shoot first, kill as many as he could before they brought him down, and hope that the townspeople could escape in the chaos. It was a bad plan, a desperate plan, but it was all he had left. Then the thunder of approaching horses echoed down the main street, and everyone froze. A dozen riders in dust-covered uniforms appeared, led by a gray-haired man with a marshal's star glinting on his chest. Behind them came a wagon carrying what looked like military equipment and supplies. The marshal rode directly into the space between Cord's men and the general store, his weathered face taking in the scene with the practiced eye of someone who'd broken up countless standoffs. "Well now," the marshal said, his voice carrying the authority of decades of service. "Looks like I arrived just in time. I'm Marshal James Calloway, territorial jurisdiction. Someone want to tell me why we got armed men facing down civilians in the middle of the day?" Cord's expression shifted rapidly: surprise, then calculation, then a carefully constructed mask of concern. "Marshal Calloway, thank God you're here. These people killed Deputy Marshal Pike and 2 federal agents. I'm Silas Cord, a concerned citizen trying to prevent further bloodshed until proper authorities could arrive." Calloway dismounted slowly, his eyes never leaving Cord's face. "That's so? Funny thing about that. I received a telegram 2 days ago from Judge Thornton in Fort Collins, asking me to investigate reports of corruption involving Deputy Pike and a businessman named Silas. Cord in Dusty Gulch said his information came from a reliable source, a man named Cole Brennan." The marshal's gaze shifted to Cole. "You wouldn't happen to be Brennan, would you?" Cole felt as if the ground had shifted beneath his feet. He'd sent no telegram, had no way to contact Judge Thornton. Then he saw Thomas, saw the guilty look on the boy's face, and understood. The kid must have sent the wire before Pike's deadline, a desperate backup plan that Cole hadn't known existed. "I'm Brennan," Cole acknowledged, lowering his weapon slightly but not holstering it. "Thought so. Thornton told me to trust you if I found you. Said you were one of the good ones, even if you had a complicated past." Cowboy turned back to Cord. "Now, Mr. Cord, why don't you and your men put down those weapons while we sort this out proper, like? And someone tell me where Deputy Pike is." "Dead in the street," one of the townspeople called out. "Shot in the back by that one." He pointed at the scar man, who suddenly looked nervous. Calloway's expression hardened. "Shot in the back? By one of his own men?" He gestured, and his deputies moved forward, surrounding Cord's hired guns with practiced efficiency. "All right, everybody's going to holster their weapons right now, and we're going to have a nice long conversation about what's been happening in this town. And Mr. Cord, I'll be particularly interested in hearing about this debt collection scheme you've been running." What followed was less a conversation than an interrogation conducted in the street under the blazing sun. The townspeople, emboldened by the marshal's presence, spoke up one after another, telling stories of intimidation, extortion, and abuse that had been building for months. Martha revealed that Cord had been watering down her liquor supply and charging her full price, threatening to evict her if she complained. Old Man Peterson showed ledgers proving that Cord had been systematically overcharging for supplies and manipulating debt payments to ensure they never decreased. The widow Harrison, her voice breaking, told how Pike had threatened to take away her daughters if she didn't pay protection money she couldn't afford. Through it all, Cord stood silent, his face growing darker as his carefully constructed empire of misery was exposed to the light. His hired guns, seeing the tide turning, began distancing themselves from their employer, claiming they'd just been following orders, that they hadn't known about the illegal activities. The scarred man who'd shot Pike tried to run, but was quickly tackled by 2 deputies. Cole kept Sarah and Thomas close, watching the proceedings but saying little. His part was done, and he preferred to let the law handle what came next. But Calloway eventually turned to him, his expression curious. "Brennan, I need to know what happened with Pike and those 2 dead men inside the store. Self-defense or murder? Your answer matters." Cole told the truth, or most of it, about Pike's arrangement with Sarah, about the planted evidence meant to frame Thomas, about the confrontation that had led to the gunfight. He didn't embellish or excuse, just laid out the facts as they'd happened. When he finished, Calloway nodded slowly. "Sounds like a clear case of self-defense to me, especially given Pike's corrupt activities. The Holloway brothers drew first. You responded with appropriate force. Pike getting shot by Cord's man is on Cord, not you." The marshal's gaze grew harder. "But Brennan, you and I need to have a separate conversation about that complicated past Thornton mentioned. There's paper on you from Missouri, old warrants that never got properly resolved. Cole had expected this. I know. I've been running from them for 3 years. Got tired of it, though. If you're arresting me, Marshal, I won't resist. But I'd appreciate it if you see that Sarah and Thomas get to Fort Collins safely first." "Nobody's arresting anybody today," Calloway said, surprising him. "Thornton's already working on getting those warrants vacated. Seems the men who issued them were Confederate sympathizers who didn't take kindly to your activities during the war. Once the judge sorts through the legal mess, you should be clear. Until then, you're free to go. but stay in the territory where we can reach you if needed." The relief Cole felt was almost painful in its intensity. For 3 years, he'd been looking over his shoulder, waiting for his past to catch him. Now, unexpectedly, he was being offered a chance at something resembling a normal life. It seemed too good to be true, which in his experience meant it probably was. Cord, however, wasn't done fighting. "This is absurd," he shouted, his composure finally cracking. "You're taking the word of criminals and debtors over a respected businessman? I have powerful friends in the territorial government, Marshal. Friends who won't appreciate you harassing me based on wild accusations from people who owe me money. Then your powerful friends can take it up with Judge Thornton," Calloway replied calmly. "In the meantime, you're under arrest for extortion, fraud, conspiracy to commit kidnapping, and about a dozen other charges I'll think up on the ride back to Fort Collins. Your hired guns are under arrest as accessories. And that one," he pointed at the scarred man, "is charged with murdering a federal officer, corrupt or not." As Cord was placed in shackles, his face a mask of impotent rage, the townspeople began to cheer. It was a tentative sound at first, disbelieving, as if they feared celebrating too soon would make it all vanish like a desert mirage. But as the reality sank in that their tormentor was finally being held accountable, that the weight pressing down on them was lifting, the cheers grew louder. Sarah turned to Cole, tears streaming down her face, and hugged him fiercely. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for not riding on, for standing with us when you had every reason not to." Cole awkwardly patted her back, uncomfortable with gratitude he didn't feel he deserved. "I didn't do much. Just bought you some time until the real help arrived." "You did everything," Thomas said, joining the embrace. "You showed us that fighting back was possible. Without you, Sarah would have ... double quotes. He couldn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Marshal Calloway approached Cole one last time. "Brennan, I meant what I said about staying in the territory. But I'm also saying something else. You've got skills. And more importantly, you've got principles underneath all that cynicism. If you're looking for work once this business is settled, I could use a deputy. God knows the territory needs more men willing to stand up to corruption." Cole looked at the marshal, then at Sarah and Thomas, then at the townspeople who were already talking about rebuilding, about making Dusty Gulch into something better. He thought about Pike's body lying in the street, about the Holloway brothers cooling in the general store, about all the violence and death that seemed to follow him wherever he went. Could a man like him really settle down, really become part of a community, really be something other than a weapon pointed at the next problem? "I'll think about it," Cole said, which was more commitment than he'd given anyone in years. The days that followed brought changes to Dusty Gulch that nobody had thought possible. Marshal Calloway left 2 deputies behind to maintain order while he transported Cord and his men to Fort Collins for trial. The townspeople, freed from the crushing weight of illegitimate debts and intimidation, began the slow work of rebuilding both their town and their lives. Sarah reopened the general store with Thomas's help, and for the first time in months, they could operate without fear. Cole stayed, partly because Calloway had asked him to, partly because he had nowhere else to go, but mostly because something about Dusty Gulch had gotten under his skin. Maybe it was the way the townspeople looked at him, not with fear or awe, but with simple gratitude. Maybe it was watching Sarah smile again, seeing Thomas stand a little straighter each day. Or maybe it was just exhaustion, the soul-deep weariness of running finally catching up with him. He took a room at Martha's saloon permanently, paying weekly in advance from the small savings he'd accumulated over his years of drifting. During the day, he helped where needed repairing buildings, mediating disputes, teaching young men like Thomas the basics of self-defense. At night, he sat on the porch and watched the stars, thinking about the strange path that had led him to this forgotten corner of the territory. 2 weeks after the confrontation, a telegram arrived from Judge Thornton. Cole read it standing in the telegraph office, his hands trembling slightly despite his attempt at composure. The warrants from Missouri had been officially vacated. Thornton had traced them back to a corrupt circuit judge who'd been issuing false warrants for Union sympathizers during the Reconstruction period. Colbrand was, legally speaking, a free man with no outstanding criminal charges. The relief should have been overwhelming, but instead, Cole felt oddly empty. He'd spent so long defining himself by what he was running from that he'd forgotten how to think about what he might be running toward. Freedom, it turned out, was more terrifying than pursuit, because it meant choices, consequences, the possibility of building something that could be lost. Sarah found him that evening sitting alone in the saloon, nursing a whiskey and staring at nothing. She sat down across from him without asking permission, her directness one of the things he'd come to appreciate about her. "Martha told me about the telegram," she said. "You're free to go now. No more looking over your shoulder." "Looks like it," Cole agreed, taking a sip of his drink. "So why do you look like someone just sentenced you to hang?" Cole was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer. "You spend enough time running. It becomes comfortable, familiar. You know what's expected of you. Keep moving. Don't form attachments. Don't let yourself care too much about anything because caring makes you vulnerable. But stopping, staying, trying to build something, that's terrifying. Because what if I'm not good at it? What if the only thing I'm really good at is violence and moving on?" Sarah reached across the table and took his hand, the gesture simple but profound. "You're good at other things. You're good at standing up for people who can't stand up for themselves. You're good at seeing what needs to be done and doing it, even when it costs you. You're good at being the kind of man that people can rely on." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "Thomas and I owe you everything, Cole. You gave us back our lives. But more than that, you gave us back our dignity, our belief that we could fight for what was right. That's worth more than gold." "I killed 3 men," Cole said quietly. "Maybe they deserved it. Maybe they didn't. But they're still dead by my hand. That's not something to be celebrated." "No," Sarah agreed. "It's not. But it's not something to be ashamed of either. Not when you did what you had to do to protect innocent people. The world isn't simple, Cole. It's not divided neatly into good people and bad people. Most of us are somewhere in between, doing the best we can with the choices we're given. You've made mistakes, I'm sure of that. But you've also done good, real good, and that matters." Over the following weeks, Cole found himself gradually integrating into the community in ways he'd never expected. When a dispute arose over water rights between 2 ranchers on the outskirts of town, the townspeople asked him to mediate, trusting his judgment to be fair. When a group of drifters rode through causing trouble, his mere presence was enough to convince them to move along peacefully. When young Thomas wanted to learn how to handle a gun properly, Cole taught him, but he also taught him about the weight of taking a life, about the importance of exhausting every other option first. He found himself growing close to Sarah in particular. Their relationship developed slowly, carefully, both of them scarred by their pasts and wary of moving too quickly. They would sit together in the evenings, talking about everything and nothing, her dreams of expanding the store, his memories of life before the war, their shared hope that Dusty Gulch might actually survive now the court was gone. There was an easiness between them that Cole hadn't felt with anyone in years, a sense that she saw him completely, the violence, the mistakes, the nobility and the weakness, and accepted all of it. One evening, about a month after Cord's arrest, Martha approached Cole with unexpected news. "Letter came for you from Fort Collins," she said, handing him an envelope with Judge Thornton's return address. "Looks official." Cole opened it carefully, half expecting some new complication, some shoe waiting to drop. Instead, he found himself reading an offer of employment. Judge Thornton, in cooperation with Marshal Cowboy, was proposing to appoint Cole as a special deputy marshal with jurisdiction throughout the territory. The position would involve investigating corruption, protecting witnesses, and handling situations that required someone with Cole's particular skills and willingness to operate in moral gray areas. The salary was modest but regular. The dangers were significant, but no worse than what he'd faced while drifting. Most importantly, the work would be legitimate, backed by proper authority, a way to use his abilities for clear good rather than just survival. It was, in every meaningful way, the opportunity for redemption he'd stopped believing he deserved. He showed the letter to Sarah that night. She read it twice, her expression unreadable, then handed it back. "You should take it," she said, though he could hear the sadness in her voice. "It's perfect for you, helping people, standing up to corruption, moving around enough that you won't feel trapped." "It would mean leaving Dusty Gulch," Cole said. "Leaving you and Thomas. I'd be on the road most of the time, going wherever the judge needed me." "I know." Sarah looked down at her hands. "But, Cole, you can't stay here just for us. That wouldn't be fair to you or to us. You need to want to be here, to choose this place and this life because it's what you genuinely want, not because you feel obligated." Her words hit him hard because they were true. He did feel obligated to Sarah and Thomas, grateful to them for giving him purpose when he'd been drifting aimlessly. But obligation wasn't the same as choosing, and Sarah deserved better than someone who stayed out of duty rather than desire. Cole spent the next 3 days wrestling with the decision. He walked the streets of Dusty Gulch really looking at it for the first time, the way the townspeople were slowly fixing up their buildings, the sound of children's laughter returning after months of fearful silence, the general sense that life was starting again. He thought about the work Thornton was offering, the chance to do on a larger scale what he'd done here, stand between the predators and their prey, use his skills to protect rather than just destroy. But he also thought about sitting on Martha's porch at sunset, about teaching Thomas to shoot, about the way Sarah smiled at him when she thought he wasn't looking. He thought about the exhaustion of always moving, always being alone, always starting over. He thought about what it might mean to have a home, a community, people who knew his name and his history and accepted him anyway. On the 4th day, he made his decision. He sent 2 telegrams, one to Judge Thornton and one to Marshal Cowboy. Then he went to find Sarah. She was at the store, doing inventory with Thomas's help. When she saw Cole's expression, she sent her brother to check on a non-existent delivery, giving them privacy. "You're leaving," she said, and it wasn't a question. "No," Cole replied. "I'm staying. I told Thornton and Calloway that I appreciate the offer, but I found where I need to be. I suggested they hire a younger man named Thomas Makepeace for the position instead. He's got potential, and he'd benefit from proper training." Sarah's eyes widened. "You ... You're giving Thomas your job?" "Cole, that's incredibly generous, but he's so young, and you need that opportunity. What I need," Cole interrupted gently, "is to stop running. I need to plant roots somewhere and see what grows. I need to be part of something bigger than just me and my survival. And I need ... double quotes." He paused, suddenly nervous in a way that gunfights never made him. "I need to see where this thing between us might go, if you're willing." Tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks, but she was smiling. "You idiot," she said affectionately. "Of course, I'm willing. I've been waiting for you to figure out what I've known for weeks, that you belong here. With us, with me." When Thomas returned and learned about the opportunity Thornton was offering him, his face went through a remarkable series of expressions: shock, disbelief, excitement, and finally determination. "I won't let you down," he promised Cole. "I'll make you proud." "You already have," Cole assured him. "Just remember what I taught you. Exhaust every other option before you reach for your gun, and never become so comfortable with violence that it stops weighing on you. The day it becomes easy is the day you lose yourself." 6 months later, Dusty Gulch was almost unrecognizable. The general store had expanded into the adjacent building, now carrying a wider variety of goods and serving customers from as far as 50 miles away. Martha's saloon had been renovated, the water damage repaired, and fresh paint applied. A new schoolhouse was under construction on the edge of town, funded by the community, and a generous donation from Judge Thornton, who'd taken a personal interest in the town's revival. Most significantly, people were moving back. Families who defled during Cord S' reign of terror returned to find a community determined to not just survive, but thrive. New businesses opened, a proper doctor's office, a bakery, even a small newspaper that Thomas helped distribute when he came home between assignments. The town was still far from prosperous, but it had something more important: hope, and the determination to build something worth keeping. Cole had settled into a role that nobody had formally appointed him to, but that everyone recognized as essential. He wasn't the law that remained the province of the occasional circuit deputy who passed through, but he was the community as problem solver, mediator, and, in rare cases, protector. When disputes arose, people came to him for fair judgment. When threats emerged, his presence was usually enough to deter them. He'd become the kind of man he'd once been before the war twisted him into something harder and colder, but with the wisdom that came from having walked through darkness and chosen to return to the light. His relationship with Sarah had deepened steadily, carefully, both of them learning to trust again. They'd married in a simple ceremony 3 months after he'd decided to stay, standing in front of Judge Thornton, who'd made the trip from Fort Collins specifically for the occasion. Martha had cried throughout the entire service, and Thomas had stood as Cole's best man, pride and happiness radiating from his young face. Marriage, Cole discovered, was its own kind of adventure, full of compromises and discoveries and moments of profound connection. Sarah challenged him, supported him, and occasionally exasperated him in equal measure. She could be stubborn and impulsive, qualities that sometimes clashed with his cautious nature. But she was also brave and compassionate and fiercely protective of those she loved. Building a life with her was harder than he'd expected and more rewarding than he'd dared hope. Thomas had proven to be a natural as a special deputy under Calloway's guidance. His youth, which Cole had initially worried about, actually worked in his favor. People underestimated him, giving him opportunities to gather information and build trust. He'd already helped break up a cattle rustling operation and exposed a corrupt land agent in Silver Creek. Each time he returned to Dusty Gulch between assignments, he seemed more confident, more capable, more certain of his place in the world. Cole couldn't have been prouder of him if he'd been his actual son. One evening, as Cole sat on his and Sarah's porch, they'd built a small house on the edge of town, modest but sturdy, watching another spectacular sunset paint the sky. He reflected on the strange path that had brought him here. A year ago, he'd been a man with no past and no future, drifting from town to town, deliberately avoiding connections that might give his life meaning because meaning implied vulnerability. He convinced himself that isolation was freedom, that caring about nothing meant nothing could hurt him. He'd been spectacularly wrong. The life he built here was precarious in ways his old life never was. Now he had people who depended on him, people he loved who could be threatened or hurt. He had responsibilities, obligations, a place in a community that expected things from him. He'd made himself vulnerable in 1,000 small ways, and that vulnerability sometimes kept him awake at night, worrying about everything that could go wrong. But it was also the most alive he'd felt in years. For all its challenges and dangers, for all the ways it scared him, this life was real in a way that drifting never was. The connections he'd formed, the love he'd found, the community he'd helped protect and rebuild, these things mattered in a way that pure survival never could. He'd become part of something larger than himself, and that participation had given his existence weight and meaning. Sarah emerged from the house, carrying 2 cups of coffee, and settled into the chair beside him. They sat in comfortable silence for a while watching the sky's colors deepen and the first stars emerge. Finally, Sarah spoke. "Penny, for your thoughts." "I was thinking about that day, when I took that step forward in your store," Cole said. "How I almost didn't. How I talked myself into believing that other people's problems weren't my concern. That getting involved would just bring me trouble I didn't need." "What changed your mind?" Sarah asked, though she'd never asked before, had respected that some things took time to articulate. Cole considered the question seriously. "I looked at Thomas's face when he came to my room that morning, saw his fear and his shame and his desperate hope that I might help. And I saw other faces behind his people I'd failed to help over the years. People I'd walked away from because helping them would have cost me something. I'd been telling myself that not getting involved was a kind of wisdom, but really, it was just cowardice dressed up in practical clothing. Your brother gave me a chance to be better than I'd been, and I was just tired enough of the man I'd become to take it." Sarah took his hand. "I'm glad you did. Not just for us, though obviously that's part of it, but for you, too. You were disappearing, Cole, becoming a ghost of a person. Now you're fully here, fully present, fully alive. That's a gift, both to us and to yourself." They sat together as darkness fell completely, the stars overhead brilliant in the clear desert air. From town came the sounds of life, continuing laughter from the saloon, a mother calling her children home, a dog barking at shadows. Simple sounds, ordinary sounds, but to Cole they were symphonic, proof of community and connection and all the messy, complicated beauty of people building lives together. Marshal Calloway rode into Dusty Gulch the next morning, his arrival unexpected but welcome. Over breakfast at Martha's, he filled Cole and Sarah in on recent developments. Silas Cord's trial had concluded with convictions on multiple counts of extortion, fraud, and conspiracy. The businessman would spend the next 20 years in territorial prison, and his assets had been seized to compensate his victims. The scarred man who'd killed Pike had been hanged after a separate trial. "There's something else," Calloway said, his expression growing serious. "Cord's lawyer made a last-ditch attempt to avoid prison by claiming that his client had been entrapped, that you'd manufactured the situation deliberately to bring him down. Claimed you were working with Judge Thornton all along, that the whole thing was a setup." Cole felt his stomach tighten. "That's not true. I didn't even know Thornton was involved until after the confrontation." "I know," Calloway assured him. "And the judge proved it conclusively. Turned out Thomas's telegram asking for help had a timestamp that put it before any of the violence occurred. And Thornton had documentation of his investigation into Cord and Pike that predated your arrival in Dusty Gulch by weeks. The lawyer's claims were dismissed, but they brought up something the judge and I wanted to discuss with you." The marshal pulled out a leather folder and opened it on the table. Inside were several official-looking documents. "Brennan, your actions here, and Thomas S. under your guidance, broke up what turned out to be a much larger corruption network than we initially realized. Cord and Pike were just the visible parts of an operation that stretched across 3 counties. We've arrested 12 more people based on evidence that came from investigating their activities here." "That's good news," Sarah said, "but I sense there's more to this story." Calloway nodded. "The territorial governor wants to recognize Cole formally for his service. There's going to be a commendation ceremony in Fort Collins next month. They want to present him with a medal and a substantial monetary reward from seized assets. It's good publicity for the territory. Shows that corruption won't be tolerated." Cole was already shaking his head before the marshal finished. "I appreciate the thought, but I don't need recognition. I did what anyone should have done in that situation. Making a big public spectacle of it seems wrong." "I expected you'd say that," Calloway replied with a small smile. "But think about what it means, Cole. Right now, there are probably dozens of towns like Dusty Gulch was places where corrupt officials and businessmen operate with impunity because people feel powerless to stop them. Your story, told publicly, might give them hope, might inspire them to stand up, to reach out for help, to refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. That's worth a little personal discomfort, isn't it? Cole looked at Sarah, who nodded encouragingly. "He's right," she said. "You don't have to enjoy being the center of attention, but you can't deny that what happened here mattered. If telling the story helps others, that seems like it's worth doing." So a month later, Cole found himself standing in front of the territorial governor, a crowd of dignitaries and citizens, watching as a medal was pinned to his chest, and his actions were described in glowing terms that made him deeply uncomfortable. Sarah stood beside him, her hand in his, while Thomas, in his deputy's uniform, beamed with pride from the front row. Judge Thornton gave a speech about courage and civic duty that was mercifully brief, and then it was over. The real meaning of the event became clear afterward, during the public reception. Person after person approached Cole, telling him their own stories of corruption and abuse, asking for advice, seeking hope. A woman from a mining town described how a claim jumper had stolen her husband, at stake, and how the local sheriff refused to investigate. A shop owner explained how a protection racket was bleeding his business dry. An elderly rancher talked about water rights being stolen through legal manipulation. Cole listened to all of them, took notes, and promised to pass their information to the proper authorities. More importantly, he told them what he'd learned in Dusty Gulch, that standing up to corruption required courage but also community, that individual resistance could be crushed, but collective action was harder to suppress, that reaching out for legitimate help was not a sign of weakness, but of wisdom. He gave them Judge Thornton's contact information and Marshall Calloway's, connected them with each other when their situations were similar, and helped them see that they weren't alone. By the end of the reception, Cole was exhausted, but he also felt something unexpected purposeful. He'd spent so many years believing that his only real skill was violence, that his value lay in his ability to outdraw other men and survive through strength. But here, he was being useful in a completely different way, as a bridge between desperate people and the systems designed to protect them, as living proof that standing up to corruption was possible. On the ride back to Dusty Gulch, Sarah was quiet for a long time before finally speaking. "You're thinking about Calloway's offer again, aren't you? About taking a position as a special deputy after all." Cole was surprised. He hadn't realized his thoughts were so transparent. "Not exactly. But I'm thinking that maybe what happened in Dusty Gulch doesn't have to be unique. Maybe there's a way to help other towns before they get as bad as ours was. I don't know exactly what that would look like, but ... double quotes," he trailed off, uncertain. "But you're wondering if there's a middle path," Sarah finished for him. "Something between staying in one place and constantly traveling. A way to be rooted here with me and our community, while also reaching out to help others." She smiled. "I think that's a wonderful idea, Cole. And I think Judge Thornton and Marshall Calloway would be interested in discussing how to make it work." Over the following months, a new system evolved. Cole remained based in Dusty Gulch, living his life with Sarah, helping maintain the community they'd built. But once a month, he would travel to Fort Collins to meet with Calloway and review cases where his particular combination of skills and experience might be useful. Sometimes he would simply write letters of advice to people in similar situations. Other times, he would make short trips to nearby towns to mediate disputes or provide moral support to people standing up to local corruption. He wasn't a lawman exactly, didn't carry a badge or have arrest authority. But he'd become something perhaps more important, a resource, a bridge, a symbol of what was possible when ordinary people refused to accept injustice. Judge Thornton began referring to him, half-jokingly, as a circuit problem solver, and the name stuck. Thomas, meanwhile, had blossomed in his role as a special deputy. His youth gave him access to situations where an older, more obviously dangerous man like Cole would have struggled. He could pose as a drifter, a ranch hand, a clerk, whatever role the investigation required. And when situations turned violent, Cole's training served him well. Though Thomas had also inherited his teacher's reluctance to use force, except as a last resort. One evening, nearly a year after the confrontation that had changed everything, Sarah told Cole she was pregnant. They were sitting on their porch again. It had become their favorite place to talk about important things, and her announcement was simple, direct, like everything about her. "We're going to have a baby. Around Christmas, if the doctor's estimate is right." Cole felt a wave of emotion so intense he couldn't immediately separate them. Joy, terror, wonder, inadequacy, a child. A new life that would depend completely on him and Sarah. A person they would shape through their choices, their examples, their love or failure to love well enough. It was overwhelming. "Are you okay?" Sarah asked, seeing his expression. "I know we hadn't really discussed this specifically, but I thought you'd be happy ... double quotes. I am." Cole managed. "God, Sarah, I'm terrified and happy in equal measure. I keep thinking about everything that could go wrong, all the ways I might fail as a father. What if I can't protect them? What if I pass on all my worst qualities? The violence, the cynicism, the..." Sarah put her fingers against his lips, silencing him. "You'll also pass on your courage, your sense of justice, your loyalty, and your capacity for growth. You'll teach them to stand up for what's right, to protect those weaker than themselves, to choose compassion even when it costs them. You'll teach them by example what it means to be a good person in a complicated world. That's all any parent can do." The baby, a daughter they named Grace, arrived in late December during the first real snow Dusty Gulch had seen in 3 years. She was tiny and perfect and terrifying in her absolute vulnerability. Cole held her for the first time and understood, with crystal clarity, what Sarah had been trying to tell him about vulnerability being strength. This small person had made him more vulnerable than he'd ever been. There was now someone in the world he would die for without hesitation. Someone whose suffering would destroy him more completely than any physical wound. But that vulnerability also connected him to every other parent in the world, to everyone who'd ever loved someone more than themselves. It made him part of the vast web of human care and connection that held civilization together. It made him, finally and irrevocably, part of something larger and more important than his individual survival. As winter gave way to spring and Grace began to grow, Cole found himself thinking often about that moment in the general store, when he'd taken that step forward toward Pike and the Holloways, when he'd done what Sarah would later call the unthinkable, not the violence. Though that was part of it, but the choice to care, to involve himself, to abandon the safety of isolation for the dangerous work of connection. He'd thought at the time that he was making a simple choice: help or walk away. But he understood now that it had been more profound than that. He'd been choosing between two fundamentally different ways of being human, one that prioritized individual survival and emotional safety above all else, and one that accepted vulnerability as the price of meaning, but understood that a life built on connections and care for all its dangers was richer and more fully human than one built on isolation and self-protection. The unthinkable thing wasn't shooting men who deserved shooting, or even putting himself in danger for strangers. The unthinkable thing was opening himself to love, to community, to all the messy complications of being woven into other people's lives. The unthinkable thing was allowing himself to be transformed from a weapon into a person, from a survivor into someone who lived for more than just survival. On Grace's first birthday, the community of Dusty Gulch threw a party that turned into a general celebration of how far they'd all come. Martha's saloon was packed. Children ran through the streets without fear, and the sound of laughter and music filled the air. Cole stood with Sarah, watching Grace take her first uncertain steps while Thomas, home on leave from his duties, cheered and clapped. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked quietly, her eyes on their daughter. "Staying here, giving up the freedom you had?" in the unforgiving expanse of the New Mexico Territory, 1878, where the sun bleaches bones white and mercy is rarer than water, a lone cowboy made a decision that would reshape the destiny of an entire region. Jack Thornton was a man haunted by his past, riding through dust and regret, when he found her, a Navajo woman left to die under the merciless sky, cast out by her own people for reasons whispered only in shame. He could have ridden past. Most men would have. But in that moment of unexpected compassion, he pulled her onto his horse and gave her water from his canteen. Her name was Ajasha, and she carried secrets that would unlock ancient knowledge, bridge warring cultures, and reveal a conspiracy that threatened to ignite the powder keg of the West. This is the story of how an outcast and a drifter became the unlikely architects of peace in a land drowning in blood, and how one woman's vision would save thousands of lives while rewriting the rules of survival in America's most brutal frontier.